So one of the great writers of the Middle English period is Geoffrey Chaucer. So he was born into a middle-class family and was educated as a squire. So in this period, we're starting to see more people from the middle class being educated and taught how to read and write. So eventually, when he was older, he went to work for the king and traveled to many places in Europe on official business. He began to write poetry and various other things in Latin and French, which was very popular at the time. So even though English had pretty much become the language of the court, the languages of higher literature were more Latin and French based. However, he made the decision to start writing in English, which was kind of unusual at that time. And we can, if we look at some examples of his writing, we can see that it does look a lot more like modern English, that especially compared with Old English, which, as we've seen before, is almost like a completely different language. Okay, so let's have a look at his poem, or the beginning of his poem, called The Canterbury Tales. So this is a photo of one of the original manuscripts of his poem. We think it was actually written, so he wrote the ideas, but he had a personal scribe or writer who actually wrote it down on the paper for him. So, yeah. Okay, so this is in sort of the medieval or Middle English script. And sort of to make it a bit easier, I've transcribed it here into modern script. So the way this would be read in Middle English, or as close as we can understand to Middle English, it would begin, "Here beginneth the book of the Tales of Canterbury. One that April with his surest sota, that rocked of March has pierced to Rota, and bathed every vine in such liqueur, of which virtue engendered is the flower. When Zephyrus eke with his sweeter breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath, the tender croppers and the younger son, athin the ram is half course run, and smaller fowlers maken melody, that slepen all the nicht with open eye. So pricketh him nature and her courages, than longen folk to go on pilgrimages." Now, you notice that there's a couple of different pronunciations there. Most of the English words are given English pronunciation, but words of French origin were given French pronunciation. Avril, liqueur, melody, courages, pilgrimages. So the G has that kind of French zh sound to it, whereas the English words have a much harder, more Germanic sound to them, as we've seen in Old English. However, it's much closer to modern English. In fact, I can read this with most of the modern English equivalents. So, when that April with his showers sweet, the drought of March has pierced to the root, and bathed every vine in such liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flower. When Zephyrus, is probably the only one that's not. With his sweet breath, inspired has in every holt and heath, the tender crops and the young sun, has in the ram his half-course run. And small fowls make melody, that sleep all the night with open eye, so pricks them nature in her courage, then long folk to go on pilgrimages. So almost all of that can be, so the main differences are things like spelling and pronunciation, but effectively Middle English is much, much closer to modern English. Okay. So basically what it's saying is that when April with its showers, so the rain generally comes in April, and it's usually very dry in March. So the water from the rain has got into the ground, and the roots of the plants are sucking up the water, and that sort of thing. And then it's sort of descriptions of things that are happening in in spring and early summer. And it's about this time when everything's been planted and it's growing well, that people start thinking about going on pilgrimages. So a pilgrimage is when people travel to go to a religious site. So a good example of that would be people going to Shikoku and traveling around the temples there. So when I used to live down in Matsuyama, we would often see people in their sort of white clothes with the hats and their sticks walking through the path, doing their pilgrimage around Shikoku. So in medieval England, the place to go was Canterbury. And so this poem is a story about a group of travelers or a group of pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. And at night, when they're either camping or staying at inns, then they are telling each other stories and have a competition to see who can tell the best story. Okay, so so this is one of the great poems of English literature in all the history. In fact, probably Shakespeare is the only poet in English history who is so Shakespeare is considered the top poet. Until Shakespeare came along, Chaucer was the greatest English poet. And he really had a big influence on poetry in England. Okay, so now let's move on.